The billionaire had only few hours to live. At his funeral, the Maid's toddler did the impossible. The heart monitor was flatlined. The room went completely silent. No beeping, no movement, no hope. The doctors, three of the best specialists in the entire country, slowly stepped back from the bed. One of them removed his gloves. Another bowed his head. The third walked to the corner of the room and quietly picked up his phone. There was nothing left to do. Richard Callaway, 48 years old, worth $2.7 billion, owner of skyscrapers and companies and private jets, was gone. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. His family was already dressed in black. The funeral home had already been called. The church had already been booked. And then, 6 hours later, at his own funeral, a 3-year-old little girl walked through those doors. The maid's daughter. A child that nobody in that room had ever paid attention to. A child who couldn't even read or write. And what she did next, what happened in the next 60 seconds, has never been medically explained. Stay with me, because this is the most powerful story you will hear this year. Before we dive into this story, I need to ask you something personal. Where are you watching this from right now? I want you to stop for just 1 second, go to the comments below, and tell me your country. Are you watching from the USA? Drop it in the comments. UK? Let me know. Canada, Australia, India, Germany, wherever you are in this world right now. Comment your country below.
Right now.
Because I want to see how far this story travels. Every single week, people from all over the world come to this channel for stories that make them feel something real. Stories that remind them in a world that moves too fast and cares too little, that there is still goodness, still miracle, still love. And today's story? Today's story is going to stay with you. I promise. Let's go. His name was Richard Callaway. And if you had met him on the street, if you had passed him in the lobby of one of his buildings, or sat across from him in a boardroom, or seen him stepping out of his black SUV with his tailored suit and his titanium watch, you would have thought one thing. This man has everything. And you would have been right. Richard had built one of the most impressive business empires in modern American history. Not inherited, not handed to him. Built, brick by brick, deal by deal, sleepless night by sleepless night, from absolutely nothing. He grew up in a small apartment in Cleveland, Ohio. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father left when Richard was 7 years old, walked out the front door one Tuesday morning, and never came back. Richard remembered standing at the window, watching his father's car disappear around the corner. He was in his pajamas. He was holding a bowl of cereal. And something changed in him in that moment. Something hardened. Something decided. I will never need anyone. I will never be left behind again. I will become so powerful that no one can ever walk away from me. And he did exactly that. By the time Richard was 23, he had taught himself coding, built a basic software tool for small businesses, and sold it to a mid-sized tech company for enough money to rent a real office. By 30, he had his first million. By 35, he had his first company valued at over $100 million. By 40, he was on the cover of Forbes magazine. The Self-Made Titan. The headline read. Richard framed it, hung it on his office wall, looked at it every morning. But here's the thing that the Forbes article didn't mention. The thing that no business profile ever talked about. The thing that Richard himself would never admit to anyone. He was desperately, profoundly, completely alone. His first marriage ended when he was 34. His wife, a kind woman named Sandra, had tried for 6 years to reach the part of Richard that was still that 7-year-old boy standing at the window in his pajamas. She never could. The divorce was quiet and clean and utterly heartbreaking. His second marriage lasted 3 years. Same story. Different woman. Same ending. He had 2 children from his first marriage, a son named Carter, now 22, and a daughter named Elise, now 19. They lived with their mother. They called on birthdays sometimes. Richard kept their school photos in his desk drawer in the back under some papers, as if even having them visible was too much vulnerability to risk. His phone had over 800 contacts. He had no one to call when the night got too quiet. And in that enormous mansion of his 14 bedrooms, 11 bathrooms, a home theater, a wine cellar, an indoor pool, Richard Calloway rattled around like a single coin in an empty jar. He had staff, of course, a chef, a driver, a personal assistant named Greg who had worked for him for 8 years and still addressed him as Sir, because Richard had never once suggested otherwise. And Maria Reyes had worked in Richard's mansion for 11 years. She arrived every morning at 7 a.m., quiet and steady and invisible, the way Richard liked his staff to be. She cleaned his floors. She laundered his suits. She polished the windows until they gleamed. She made sure fresh flowers were placed in the entrance hallway every Monday because she had noticed, years ago, that Richard always paused near them when he came home. Just for a second. Just long enough to breathe. She never mentioned that she noticed. She just kept the flowers there. Richard never thanked her. Not because he was cruel, but because he simply did not see her. She was part of the house, the way the furniture was part of the house. Present. Functional. Unacknowledged. But Maria saw Richard. She saw everything. She noticed when he stopped eating. She noticed the new medications appearing on his nightstand. She noticed the way he sometimes stood at the window of his study for 20 minutes without moving, staring at something only he could see. She worried about him the way you worry about someone you care for, quietly, privately, without expectation of anything in return. And she prayed for him. Every night, in her small apartment across town, after her daughter was asleep, Maria Reyes got on her knees and prayed for the man who had never once learned her last name. Because that is the kind of woman Maria was. And her daughter was something else entirely. Lily Reyes was 3 years old. Curly dark hair that never stayed in its ponytail. Big brown eyes that looked at the world with the kind of total, fearless wonder that only very young children possess. She had started coming to the mansion with her mother on days when the daycare was closed, toddling through the hallways, running her fingers along the walls, asking questions about everything. What's that? Why is this room so big? Does the man who lives here have any toys? Maria would shush her gently and redirect her. Richard was never to be disturbed. But once, just once, Lily had wandered into Richard's study while he was on a phone call. She had stood in the doorway, looking at him with those enormous eyes. Richard had glanced up, startled. For one single second, their eyes met. Lily had smiled at him. The completely unguarded, full-faced smile of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of powerful people. Richard had looked away immediately and continued his phone call. But later that night, alone in his 14-bedroom house, he had thought about that smile. He couldn't explain why. He just had. It started with headaches. That was how it always started, Richard would later think. Not with a crash. Not with a dramatic moment. Just a dull, persistent ache behind his left eye that showed up one Monday morning and never fully went away. Richard ignored it. Because Richard ignored everything that did not directly contribute to closing deals and building empires. He took ibuprofen. He drank more coffee. He pushed through. That was what he did. He pushed through. The headaches got worse. By the 3rd week, they were arriving in waves, sudden, blinding surges of pain that would force Richard to stop mid-sentence in meetings and press his fingers to his temple. His assistant Greg noticed. His driver noticed. Richard noticed that they noticed and told them both, firmly, that he was fine. He was not fine. The blackouts started on a Thursday. Richard was in his car, being driven to a morning meeting, when the world simply switched off. One moment he was checking his phone. The next moment he was being shaken by his driver, who was pale and terrified, calling his name over and over. Richard had been unconscious for 4 minutes. He told his driver it was exhaustion. He told him not to mention it to anyone. He went to the meeting anyway. But 2 days later, a Saturday, during a $40 million merger meeting with 6 other executives in his conference room, Richard Calloway stood up to walk to the whiteboard. and collapsed.
Just like that.
Mid-sentence. Like a building with its foundations suddenly pulled out from under it. He woke up in the hospital. And that was when everything changed. Dr. Patricia Huang was the neurologist who delivered the news. She was calm and precise and compassionate, and Richard respected her immediately, which made what she said hit even harder. She sat across from him in that sterile white room, and she laid it out clearly, the way Richard had always insisted people speak to him. No softening, no dancing around it, just the truth. Richard, the MRI results show a mass in your right temporal lobe. Based on the imaging and the biopsy results, we are looking at glioblastoma multiforme. Grade 4. Richard was quiet for a moment. Which means, he said, it's an aggressive form of brain cancer, Dr. Huang said. One of the most aggressive we know of. Another silence. Treatment options? We can discuss radiation and chemotherapy. They may extend your timeline. But Richard, she paused, and in that pause was everything. Given the size of the mass, its location, and how quickly it appears to have developed, we are not talking about a cure. We are talking about management. How long? Richard asked. Dr. Huang held his gaze. Weeks, she said quietly. Possibly less. Richard nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, that had shaken the hands of presidents and CEOs and heads of industry. They were trembling slightly. He hadn't noticed that before. Okay, he said. Just okay. Dr. Huang had delivered terminal diagnoses to many patients in her career. She had seen people break down completely. She had seen people rage and deny and bargain desperately with reality. She had never seen anyone simply say okay and mean it. It frightened her a little, she would later admit, because it was not strength she saw in Richard Calloway's eyes in that moment. It was something far more heartbreaking. It was the look of a man who had already accepted that there was no one to fight for. Richard went home that evening. He sat in his study for a long time. He looked at the Forbes cover on his wall. He looked at his 800 contact phone. He looked out the window at the city's skyline lit up against the dark sky, beautiful and blazing and completely indifferent to whether he lived or died. And for the first time since he was a 7-year-old boy watching his father's car disappear around the corner, Richard Calloway cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the dark, alone. He called his son Carter the next morning. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He called his daughter Elise. Same thing. He left no messages. He did not try again. He called his attorney instead and began updating his will. The treatment started within the week. Radiation. Chemotherapy. The best medical team money could assemble. Richard endured it all with the same grim, silent determination he brought to everything in his life. But the tumor was merciless. It did not respond the way the doctors hoped. It grew. It pressed. It took things from Richard one by one, his energy, his concentration, his ability to work the 18-hour days that had defined his entire adult life. Within 3 weeks, Richard could no longer come into the office. Within 5 weeks, he could no longer leave the house. Maria came every day. She kept the flowers in the hallway. She made sure his medications were organized. She moved quietly through the mansion like a gentle shadow, keeping everything in order as Richard's world fell apart. One afternoon, she brought Lily with her. Lily toddled into the sitting room where Richard was resting on the couch, thin and exhausted and pale. She looked at him with those enormous brown eyes. "Are you sick?" she asked. Richard looked at her. "Yes," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in weeks. Lily considered this very seriously. Then she said, "My mama makes me soup when I'm sick. It helps." Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 5 weeks, he almost smiled. The night Richard Calloway nearly died was a Tuesday. It had been raining since morning, the kind of heavy, relentless November rain that makes the world feel like it is grieving something. The mansion was quiet. The staff had gone home. Maria had stayed late to finish some things and had only left an hour before. Richard was in his bedroom on the second floor. He had been moved there from the hospital 3 days earlier, at his own insistence. He had been very clear about it. He did not want to die in a hospital room. He did not want to die surrounded by machines and strangers and the smell of antiseptic. If this was going to end, it was going to end in his own home. His private nurse, a steady and experienced woman named Diane, was monitoring him through the night. At 2:17 a.m., the monitors changed. Diane was on her feet immediately. She checked his vitals. She checked again. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Huang directly, not the answering service, Dr. Huang's personal number, which she had been given for exactly this moment. "It's happening," Diane said quietly. Dr. Huang arrived within 20 minutes. She took one look at the readings and made the call. "We need to move him. Now." The ambulance came. Richard was transferred to the hospital in the early hours of the morning, unconscious, his body finally losing the battle it had been fighting for weeks. By 4 a.m., he was in the ICU. By 6 a.m., his family had been called. Carter arrived first. He stood in the hallway outside his father's room with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. He had driven 3 hours through the night to get there. He looked exhausted and scared and like a young man who had a lot of unfinished conversations that might now never happen. Elise arrived an hour later. She walked straight to her brother, and they stood together in silence, not quite touching, both of them carrying years of complicated feelings about a man they had never fully known. Richard's ex-wife Sandra, Carter and Elise's mother, had been called as well. She did not come, but she sent a message through Carter. "Tell him I'm praying for him." Carter did not deliver the message. He didn't know how. The doctors worked through the morning. Specialists were called in. Every option was explored, discussed, attempted. By midday, Dr. Huang came to speak to the family. She was gentle but direct, the way Richard had always respected. "The tumor has progressed significantly overnight," she said. "His brain function is diminishing. We have done everything we can do." She paused. "I think it's time to prepare yourselves." Carter stared at her. "How long?" "Hours," Dr. Huang said. "I'm sorry." Elise pressed her hand over her mouth. Carter turned and looked at the wall. In her small apartment across town, Maria had heard the news through a call from Greg, Richard's assistant. She sat at her kitchen table with her phone in her hands and tears running down her face. Lily climbed into her lap. "Mama, what's wrong?" Maria held her daughter close and tried to find the words to explain to a 3-year-old that the world was about to lose someone. That even difficult people, even closed-off people, even people who had never once said thank you deserved to be grieved. "The man we work for, baby," Maria whispered. "He's very, very sick." Lily was quiet for a long moment. She could feel her mother's sadness the way small children feel everything, completely, in her whole body. Then she slipped off Maria's lap and walked to the little corner of the living room that was hers. A small table, a box of crayons, a stack of drawings that Maria had been meaning to put in a folder. Lily picked up a piece of paper and a handful of crayons. Maria watched her daughter draw with the intense focus that only children at play possess, her small tongue poking out slightly, her brow furrowed, her crayon moving in careful, deliberate strokes. After a few minutes, Lily folded the paper carefully, the way she had seen Maria fold letters. She carried it back to her mother and held it out. "Give this to the sick man, Mama," she said. "It'll make him feel better." Maria took the folded paper. She opened it gently. It was a drawing. A house, the big house, recognizable by the tall windows Lily had always loved pressing her face against. A bright yellow sun in the corner. 2 stick figures in the front, one tall, one very small. And underneath, in the shaky, enormous letters of a child who had just learned to write her first words. "Friend." Maria broke down completely. She held the drawing to her chest and she wept, for Richard, for her daughter's impossible goodness, for all the years of invisible kindness that the world so rarely acknowledges. Back at the hospital, The afternoon passed in terrible slowness. Richard's vitals deteriorated through the evening. By 9 p.m., he had lost consciousness entirely. By midnight, Dr. Huang came back to speak to the family again. The machines were the only things keeping Richard's body present now. The family gathered in the room. Carter stood on one side. Elise stood on the other. They each held one of their father's hands, perhaps for the first time in their adult lives. At 1:44 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Richard Calloway was declared clinically unresponsive. The decision was made. The funeral home was called. The church was booked. And in her apartment across town, Maria Reyes held her daughter's drawing and prayed one last desperate prayer for a man who had never known how much he was loved. Wednesday arrived gray and cold. The kind of morning that feels like the world itself is in mourning, the sky low and heavy, the streets quiet, the bare November trees standing like silent witnesses along the road to the church. St. Matthew's was a beautiful old stone church in the center of the city. Richard had never attended a service there in his life, but his attorney had made the arrangements, and it was large enough to hold the crowd that was expected, because even if Richard Calloway had died alone, in terms of public profile, he had not lived unnoticed. By 9 a.m., cars were already arriving. Business associates in dark suits, investors, former employees, a city councilman who owed Richard 3 favors and was there out of obligation more than grief. Journalists stood at a respectful distance on the sidewalk outside, cameras ready. Inside, the family had gathered. Carter and Elise sat in the front pew, side by side, looking like two people in a dream they desperately wanted to wake up from. Carter kept checking his phone, then putting it away, then checking it again. Elise hadn't spoken in 2 hours. Richard's attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Hale, moved quietly through the gathering crowd, speaking in low tones, managing the details that death always leaves behind. The casket, dark mahogany, understated, the way Richard would have wanted, stood at the front of the church. Richard's Forbes cover photo was displayed on a board near the entrance. The self-made titan. He looked younger in it, more fierce, less tired. Greg, Richard's assistant of 8 years, stood near the back of the church and cried silently in a way he would have been mortified for anyone to notice. Maria almost didn't come. She had told herself she wouldn't. She was the staff. She was invisible. She had no place at the funeral of a man like Richard Calloway, surrounded by powerful people who had never heard of her. But Lily had asked her. That morning, while Maria was getting dressed in the only dark dress she owned, Lily had appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. "Are we going to say goodbye to the sick man, Mama?" Maria looked at her daughter. "I don't know, baby." Lily held up her drawing, still carefully folded, slightly crumpled now from being carried around all night. "We have to give him this first," Lily said. Simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And Maria, who had spent 11 years being invisible, who had spent her whole life moving quietly through spaces that were not designed for her, who had never once asked anything of the world, said yes. She took Lily's hand. She picked up her bag. She walked out the door. They took the bus across town. Lily sat beside her mother with her drawing held carefully in both hands, watching the gray city move past the window with those enormous, curious eyes. When they arrived at St. Matthew's and Maria saw the crowd, the suits, the cameras, the gleaming black cars, she almost stopped, almost turned back. But Lily was already walking toward the doors. Maria followed. Inside, the organ was playing softly. The gathered crowd filled most of the pews. Maria recognized no one. She felt every eye in the room as they entered. She could feel the quiet assessment, the unspoken questions. Who is she? What is she doing here? A man in a dark suit, one of the funeral home staff, moved toward them. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you?" He stopped, because Lily had let go of her mother's hand. She had spotted the casket at the front of the church, that large, dark, polished box, and something in her 3-year-old heart had understood what it was. She had seen her grandmother laid out in a casket 2 years ago. She remembered, and she walked toward it, not running, walking, with complete, calm purpose. The crowd parted. People stepped aside without quite knowing why, drawn by something in this tiny girl's certainty, some instinctive human response to witnessing absolute innocence in motion. Carter looked up from the front pew and saw her coming. Elise turned. Douglas Hale stopped mid-sentence. Greg, at the back of the church, stood up straighter. Lily walked all the way to the front of St. Matthew's Church, her small shoes making tiny sounds on the stone floor. She stopped in front of the casket. She was barely tall enough to reach the edge of it. She placed her small hand flat on the dark wood. She closed her eyes, and in a voice that was quiet but absolutely, perfectly clear, the pure, unself-conscious voice of a child with no fear and no pretense, she said, "Wake up. I brought you a picture." The church was completely silent, not the polite, managed silence of a formal ceremony. The stunned, electric silence of a room full of people who have just felt something shift. Carter stared. Elise had her hand over her mouth. Maria stood frozen at the back of the church, tears running freely down her face. And then, from the front of the church, a sound. A monitor. A beeping. Dr. Alan Mercer, Richard's lead physician, who had come to pay his respects, was on his feet before anyone else understood what was happening. Because the sound was coming from the small medical monitoring device that had been placed with the body, as protocol required. A sound that had been flat and silent for hours. Was beeping. The next 60 seconds were chaos. Dr. Mercer moved through the crowd fast, people stumbling out of his way as he pushed toward the front of the church. He had his phone in his hand already, calling for emergency services, his voice low and urgent and completely controlled, the voice of a man with 31 years of medical training suddenly activated in the middle of a funeral. The funeral home attendant reached the casket first. He checked the monitor. He looked up at Dr. Mercer with an expression that said everything. There's a... Don't move him, Dr. Mercer said sharply. He reached the casket. He checked Richard's pulse. He checked again. Faint. Impossibly faint. But there. Call 911, he said loudly to the room. Right now. Everyone stepped back. The church erupted. People were on their feet. Voices colliding. Someone near the back knocked over a flower arrangement. Carter pushed forward, grabbing Dr. Mercer's arm. What's happening? What? He's alive, Dr. Mercer said. And even as he said it, he heard the disbelief in his own voice. Carter, your father is alive. I need you to step back and let me work. Carter stepped back. He sat down on the nearest pew, just collapsed onto it, actually because his legs stopped working, and he stared at his father's face. And he saw it. The faintest movement. The barely there rise and fall of Richard Calloway's chest. Breathing. His father was breathing. Elise had grabbed her brother's arm. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes, the longest 8 minutes of everyone present's life. Dr. Mercer worked the entire time, monitoring, assessing, keeping Richard stable with the equipment the funeral home had on site and the basic kit from his own car. Lily had been gently lifted away from the casket by her mother and was sitting in a pew, watching everything with wide, calm eyes. She did not seem frightened. She seemed, if anything, satisfied, the way children look when something they fully expected to happen has gone ahead and happened. As the paramedics rushed in with their equipment and the church transformed from a funeral into an emergency scene, Dr. Mercer stepped back for one moment. He looked at Lily. She looked at him. I told him to wake up, she said. Dr. Mercer, a man who had spent his entire career in the absolute discipline of medical science, who believed in data and evidence and peer-reviewed research, did not have a single word to say to that. He simply nodded and turned back to his patient. The ambulance left St. Matthew's Church at 11:23 a.m., 17 minutes after Lily Reyes had placed her hand on a dead man's casket and asked him to wake up. The crowd outside the church watched it go in total silence. Cameras forgotten. Phones lowered. A journalist who had covered business news for 20 years stood on the sidewalk with tears on his face and no idea what article he was going to write. In the ICU, the next hours were the most intense of Dr. Huang's career. Richard's return to consciousness was not immediate. It was slow and halting, like a man climbing out of something very deep. His brain activity, which had been almost undetectable, began, inexplicably, impossibly, to increase. The medical team ran every test they had. They checked for errors in the original diagnosis. They checked the monitoring equipment. They reviewed every piece of data from the previous 24 hours with obsessive thoroughness, looking for the explanation, looking for the logical, rational, scientifically defensible reason that Richard Calloway's brain was waking back up. They did not find one. By 4 p.m., Richard was showing clear signs of consciousness. By 6 p.m., he was responding to stimuli. By 8 p.m., 18 hours after he had been declared clinically unresponsive, Richard Calloway opened his eyes. The room was dim. The monitors were beeping steadily. Dr. Huang was there. A nurse was there. Carter and Elise were there. They had not left the hospital. Richard blinked slowly at the ceiling. Then he turned his head. Carter was standing at the side of the bed. He looked wrecked, red-eyed, unshaven, wearing the same suit he'd had on at the church. He looked like a young man who had aged 10 years in a single day. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, rough from hours of silence, "Carter." Carter made a sound that was not quite a word. He reached out and grabbed his father's hand. Both hands held on with the desperate grip of someone who had almost lost something and had only just understood how much it mattered. "Dad," he managed. Richard squeezed back. It was the most physical affection they had exchanged in 15 years. Dr. Huang stepped forward, calm and professional, and began her assessment. She checked his responses. She asked him basic orientation questions, his name, the date, where he was. Richard answered each one slowly but correctly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Richard was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved around the room, the equipment, the ceiling, his son's face, the window where the city lights were beginning to appear in the evening dark. "Strange," he said finally. Dr. Huang allowed herself a small, quiet breath of something that was not quite professional composure. "That is," she said carefully, "entirely understandable." Later that night, after Carter and Elise had finally been persuaded to go rest, after the medical team had run their last round of checks and the room had quieted down, Richard lay in the darkness and thought. He thought about all of it. The diagnosis. The months of decline. The last night in his mansion in the rain. The hospital. The darkness. And through the darkness, a sound. A voice. Small and clear and completely fearless. "Wake up. I brought you a picture." Richard did not know, in that moment, the full story of what had happened. He did not know that he had been placed in a casket. He did not know that a funeral had been held. He did not know that the entire sequence of events that had brought him back to consciousness had been set in motion by a 3-year-old girl with a crayon drawing. He only knew the voice. And he knew, in the way you sometimes know things that cannot be explained, that it had mattered. The medical community did not know what to call it. Spontaneous neurological recovery was the term Dr. Huang used in her report, careful, clinical, defensible language for something that her 30 years of medical experience told her was essentially impossible. The tumor was still there. That much was clear. The follow-up MRIs showed it unchanged, the same mass, the same location, the same grade 4 classification that had been a death sentence 6 weeks earlier. And yet, Richard's brain function had returned. Not partially. Not in fragments. Fully. The cognitive assessments showed results that should not have been possible given the imaging. His speech was clear. His memory was intact. His responses were sharp. A second opinion was brought in. Then a third. Four different neurologists reviewed his case over the following 2 weeks and arrived at 4 versions of the same conclusion. We cannot explain this. One of them, a researcher from Johns Hopkins who had spent 20 years studying glioblastoma, sat with Richard for 3 hours going through every detail of his case. At the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and said, with the careful precision of a man who deeply distrusted words he couldn't defend in a journal, "Mr. Calloway, in my professional opinion, what has occurred here is outside the parameters of what I can account for medically." Richard looked at him. "Is that your way of saying it's a miracle?" The researcher considered this for a long moment. "It's my way of saying," he said finally, "that I am going to need more data." Richard almost smiled. Recovery was slow. He was in the hospital for 3 more weeks after that first extraordinary night of consciousness. Physical therapy, every day. Cognitive exercises. Gradual, careful rebuilding. But Richard worked at it the way he had worked at everything in his life, with total, focused determination. The difference was that this time he knew what he was working toward. Not a deal. Not a quarterly report. Not a number on a balance sheet. He was working toward time. Time to do the things he had never done. Time to say the things he had never said. Time to become someone his children might actually want to know. Carter came every day. That was perhaps the second miracle. Quieter than the first, less dramatic, but in its own way just as profound. Carter Calloway, 22 years old, who had spent most of his life at a careful emotional distance from his father, started showing up at 9 a.m. and staying until visiting hours ended. He brought coffee. He brought his laptop and did his work from the chair in the corner of his father's room. He told Richard about his life, his apartment in Boston, the entry-level architecture job he'd taken 6 months ago, the girlfriend he hadn't mentioned to anyone in the family yet. Richard listened. He didn't offer advice. He didn't redirect the conversation toward business lessons or productivity insights, the only parenting mode he had ever really known. He just listened, asked questions, learned his son. It turned out Carter was funny. Dry, quiet, observant humor that Richard recognized as his own, transmitted somehow across years of absence. It turned out Carter was kind. The way he talked about his girlfriend, about his coworkers, about the old woman who lived next door to his apartment building and whose groceries he carried up the stairs every Saturday, there was a genuine warmth there that Richard found both wonderful and quietly devastating. His son had become a good person, in spite of everything. Without him, Elise came less frequently, but was no less present when she did. She was studying social work at a university in Chicago. She wanted to work with at-risk youth. She sat at her father's bedside on her second visit and told him about a kid she was working with through her internship, a 12-year-old boy whose situation clearly broke her heart, and Richard listened and at the end of it said, "You're going to be extraordinary at this." Elise looked at him for a moment like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean it," Richard said. A silence. "I know," Elise said. And something in the room shifted, slightly, permanently. On the 14th day of his recovery, Maria came to visit. She came after her shift, still in her work clothes, with Lily holding her hand. Maria had not planned to come. She had told herself it wasn't her place. She had told herself that Richard was surrounded by family now, by important people, by the world that actually belonged to him, and that she should stay in her lane, the way she always had. But Lily had asked. They found Richard sitting up in bed, doing a word puzzle, occupational therapy. He looked up when they appeared in the doorway. His eyes went immediately to Lily. Lily looked at him with those enormous brown eyes. "You woke up," she said. "I did," Richard said. "I told you to," she said. "I know," Richard said. "I heard you." Maria made a small sound and pressed her hand over her mouth. Lily walked into the room, completely at ease, and climbed up onto the visitor's chair. She reached into the small bag she was carrying, her drawing bag, the one she brought everywhere, and produced a new piece of paper. She held it out to Richard. He took it carefully. unfolded it. A new drawing. The hospital squarish, with lots of windows, the way a child sees a building. A figure in a bed. A small figure standing next to it. And the same enormous, careful letters as before. Friend. Richard looked at the drawing for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Can I keep this one too? He asked. Lily nodded seriously.
That's why I made it, she said.
Richard Calloway walked out of the hospital on a Thursday morning in December. The sky was clear and cold and very blue. He stood on the sidewalk outside the entrance and just breathed in and out, the sharp winter air filling his lungs, and looked at the city around him with the eyes of someone who had seen it from the other side and come back. Carter was there to drive him home. Elise had taken the train from Chicago and was waiting at the mansion. Even Greg, his assistant of 8 years, was there, standing slightly awkwardly by the car, unsure of the protocol for the return of a man you had watched be put in a casket 4 weeks earlier. Richard walked up to Greg and shook his hand. Not the firm, transactional handshake of a boss, a real handshake. 2 hands. Eye contact. Thank you, Greg, he said. For everything. Greg nodded rapidly and looked away and pretended to check something on his phone. The mansion felt different when Richard walked back in. Or maybe Richard was different, and the mansion simply reflected that. He stood in the entrance hallway and looked at it, the gleaming floors, the high ceilings, the enormous windows, and saw it clearly for what it was. Not a home, a trophy, a monument to winning. Beautiful, impressive, and completely empty of what actually mattered. He kept the flowers that Maria had left by the entrance. He sat down at the kitchen table, not in his study, not at his desk, the kitchen table, and he started writing. He wrote for 2 hours. No phone, no laptop, just a legal pad and a pen. He wrote down every name, every person who had been present in his life and invisible to him, every kindness he had failed to acknowledge, every conversation he had cut short, every birthday card he had not sent, every time he had chosen the deal over the human being. It was a long list. He did not feel sorry for himself looking at it. He simply looked at it clearly, the way he had always preferred to look at problems, directly, without flinching, and then he started figuring out what to do about it. The first call he made was to Maria. I want to talk to you, he said. Not as your employer. I want to sit down and actually talk to you. When can you come? Maria was silent for a moment. I can come Saturday, she said carefully. Please bring Lily, Richard said. Saturday, Maria sat across from Richard at that kitchen table, the same table she had cleaned hundreds of times without ever being invited to sit at, and Richard told her what he knew. What Lily had done. What it had meant. Maria cried. She tried not to, but she did. Richard did not look away. He did not redirect the conversation. He simply waited, with a patience that was new to him, until she was ready to speak. She just wanted to give you that drawing, Maria said finally. She talked about you, you know. More than you knew. She used to ask me about you. Richard was quiet. What did she ask? If you were happy, Maria said. Richard absorbed this. A 3-year-old child who had been invisible to him had been wondering whether he was happy, had been praying for him, had carried a drawing across the city to give to a man she barely knew because her 3-year-old heart had decided, simply and completely, that he was her friend. Was I? Richard asked quietly. Happy. Maria looked at him. No, she said gently. You weren't. He nodded slowly. No, he agreed. I wasn't. The changes came gradually but steadily over the following months. Richard sold his second and third companies. Not in desperation, strategically, deliberately clearing space. He kept his first company, the one he had built from nothing on that second-hand laptop in Cleveland, and he restructured it with a new leadership team and a new mandate. Not just profitability, but purpose. He established the Calloway Foundation, an organization focused on supporting families dealing with terminal illness. The seed money was $40 million. The first initiative was a program providing free in-home care and emotional support to families of terminally ill patients. the kind of support that had been completely absent from Richard's own experience. He set up a full college fund for Lily Reyes. Unconditional. No strings. A letter to be opened when she turned 18, explaining why. He bought Maria a house. 3 bedrooms, good school district, paid in full. He arranged it through his attorney so that Maria couldn't refuse it. By the time she found out, the paperwork was already done. When she called him, furious and overwhelmed and crying all at once, Richard said simply, "You prayed for me for 11 years. I have a lot of catching up to do." He reconnected with Carter and Elise in ways that were imperfect and slow and sometimes awkward and real. Sunday dinners that were occasionally uncomfortable and always worth it. Phone calls that lasted longer than either of them expected. A trip to Cleveland, just Richard and Carter, to see the apartment building where Richard had grown up. They stood on the sidewalk outside it in the cold, and Richard told his son things he had never told anyone. About his father leaving, about the window, about the bowl of cereal, about deciding, at 7 years old, never to need anyone. Carter listened to all of it. Then he said quietly, "I'm glad you changed your mind." Richard looked at his son. "Me too," he said. He had 2 of Lily's drawings framed and hung in his office. The original Friend drawing from the night Maria had cried at the kitchen table, and the hospital drawing from his recovery. They hung where the Forbes cover used to be. Visitors noticed them immediately. They always asked the same thing. "What are those?" And Richard always told them. Every single time. He never got tired of the story. Because the story, unlike the Forbes cover, unlike the billion-dollar valuations, unlike every deal he had ever closed, was true. Not the curated, managed, press release version of truth. Actually, completely, humanly true. A 48-year-old man who had everything and felt nothing. A 3-year-old girl with a crayon and a fearless heart. And a word that a child had written in enormous, shaky letters. The most important word she knew. Friend. Richard Calloway had $2.7 billion. He had buildings with his name on them. He had a Forbes cover. He had 800 contacts in his phone. And it took a little girl 3 years old, the maid's daughter, the one nobody noticed, to give him the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Someone who saw him. If this story moved you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because every week we find the stories that remind you what it means to be alive. And in the comments below, tell me, what did this story make you feel? I read every single one. See you in the next one.